the question comes up, which has now been debated very heatedly in the Islamic world and in a new light in Iran itself. The question is the Sharia static or dynamic? Is God's will for us a static pattern, or does it change with the circumstances? This is one of the most powerful and difficult problems that the Islamic world has faced during the last century. It did not face it before because Islamic civilization was strong enough in other periods to impose its values upon the environment around it. I always give this example. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, invaded Khorasan and later the rest of Persia and Iraq and killed about 20 million people in that area, it was a very major catastrophe. He brought with him Mongolian laws, which for a while in Iran were being implemented. But no one in the world at that time thought, well, we have to keep up with the times. The times are the times of the Mongols, so let's change Islamic law according to the times. I don't know of any single jurist or Islamic thinker who had that view. But since the 19th century, because of the power of Western civilization during the colonial period and following after the wake of the colonial period, we're still in the colonial period, but in another dress. It hasn't changed completely, but it's the political colonial period coming to an end. This foreign civilization was so powerful militarily and politically that gradually it weakened the will of many people in the Islamic world, who began to say that we must accommodate the Sharia to the changing conditions of the times. And the great debate came up, which goes on as a major question within the whole of the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, the Sunni world, the Shiite world, doesn't matter where it is, whether Sharia is to be adopted to the world around us or the world around us is to be made according to the Sharia. This is a very important question, and it's not the question to be answered tonight. I've already, in some of my writings, have written about this in a rather categorical way. Everyone knows where I stand on this, and it can be summarized by a lecture which I gave in India in 1962 when they were going to change the Muslim personal law. The story I oftentimes told my students because of one of the critical moments of my life in front of the late Jawaharlal Nehru and Radhakrishnan, who was then President of India, and Indira Gandhi, who was then bringing her father around, and all of the dignitaries of India and all of the ulama of India that assembled this session in order to convince the Indian Muslims. There was during the first Congress of Orientalism ever held in Asia. And they had speakers from Egypt and Turkey and several Islamic countries. And unfortunately for India, they also had me as a speaker from Iran. Because the other people just say, oh yes, we have to change the personal laws, we have to keep up with the times, the situation in India is different. But somehow during that day, the blood of my ancestors said, no, Hossein curdled in my veins, and I said I couldn't say this nonsense. And I made this comment that if we have to change with the times, what do the times have to change with? And nobody could answer that question. And the whole thing cracked. And in fact, it saved his Muslim personal law for the next 30 years. It was very interesting. Historically, you should know that Nehru was sitting just where this young man is sitting from Pakistan. And he had a heart attack right in front of me. That was Nehru's heart attack. I mean, it was unbelievable how tense that atmosphere was. And it was dragged out. And that was the beginning of the end of Nehru. My position has always been very clear that Islam cannot surrender itself to external conditions on the excuse that you have to accommodate yourself to those conditions. Because the question comes up, upon what principles are those conditions functioning? What are those conditions? If those conditions are in accordance with Islamic principles, fine. If they're not, we must try to change those conditions, not to try to change the principles. However, having said this, it must be understood that the Sharia has never been like a static building. It is like a great tree. A tree is both static and dynamic. If the roots of a tree were to be dynamic, the tree would die immediately. You would not have a tree left in your garden next spring. But if the branches were not dynamic, the tree would have died anyway. The tree is a wonderful symbol of the combination of status and endynamis in Greek, that is the static and the dynamic. Because, as I said, the roots of the tree are firm, and that's what gives the life to the tree. But as long as the tree is alive, its branches grow. And if there's a difficult winter, it grows somewhat differently from when the winter is not so harsh. That's natural. Now the Sharia is like that tree. It is both static and dynamic. That is, the Sharia can accommodate itself in the sense that if you and I are in a plane and flying from here to New Zealand and the plane will not land, what do we do with our daily prayers? It's not like the old caravanserais where the camels would stop for ask prayer, where we get off the camel and say their prayers and get on the camel again. What do we do? Or what do we do if you're driving all day long? What do we do in this hectic life that we have in American cities? How to be able to perform the rites and so forth and so on. Those, the Sharia can always accommodate itself to, but it cannot surrender its principles to something which is against the principles contained in the Quran and the Hadith. So this great debate that is going on, I know in Iran, it's been like a flame that has, in a sense, caused a fire in many, many circles during the last 10 years on whether the Sharia is static or dynamic. And the debate has also reached Qom, as it exists in Al-Azhar University and other centers of also Sunni learning, about the question of static and dynamic. And most of the problem does not have to do with the Sharia. It has to do with the inferiority complex of Muslims vis-a-vis civilization, towards which many of them feel psychologically inferior. And not that they are inferior, but they feel psychologically inferior. Therefore, in a sense, they are inferior, but they're not in reality. But they feel that. And therefore, they always try to accommodate. They don't want to change the situation on the ground. They always want to conform themselves to the situation on the ground. And if that follows, in the future, I believe that Islam will end up like Protestant Christianity, in which religion is always changed to conform to the times. In the 19th century, Christianity tried to accommodate itself to the 19th century. By now, everything in the 19th century is out of fashion. It sounds very funny, but the Schleiermacher wrote in the 19th century in Germany. No serious Protestant theologian would follow that. But at that time, that was up-to-date theology. And since you invited me to talk here, my view has always been that the only thing which is timely is the timeless. And to be up to date is to be out of fashion very quickly, out of date. Anything that's up to date, it's terrible, religiously speaking, because by the time you finish your sentence, it is already out of date. So this desire that we have to be always up to date, I think, is one of the great psychological ailments of modern society. What are called the absolutization of the transient. We always absolutize the transient flow around us. We try to make values out of things which change all the time, and then criticize God-given institutions on that basis. This is a crisis which Catholicism faces, Hinduism faces, Judaism faces, and Islam also faces. It's a very, very important international crisis. But as far as Islam is concerned, the role that the Sharia has played over the centuries has always been to have its roots like the root of a tree, static. And static in the sense that is the divine reality. God, of course, is Al-Hayy and Al-Muhyi. He is both life and the giver of life. But He is also Al-Mateen. He is permanent. He does not change. And from that changelessness, which is the Quranic revelation, His word, you have the aspect of status. From the inner life of Islam, which God determined to live in under all circumstances, you have the dynamic aspect. And in the future will tell to what extent the Muslims will be able to face this challenge, as Muslims of old did. When Islam went to China, can you imagine how difficult it was to apply the Sharia in a country in which everything has pork in it, including ice cream, practically? What to do to create a kind of living space for themselves, to be able to practice the Sharia. It was not an easy matter, but they did it. There are 100 million Chinese Muslims. When Islam came to India, a land where divinity was symbolized by various statues and what appeared to be like pre-Arabic, pre-Islamic Arabic idolatry, although it's not that at all. But the Muslims understood that very quickly and were able to create a major Islamic civilization right amidst the vast sea of Hinduism. When Islam went to Black Africa, when it went to Senegal, to Nigeria, it was very different from Mecca and Medina or Isfahan and Tus. It was a very different world, but the Sharia remained permanent while accommodating itself to various circumstances. And that, I believe, is a key to the understanding of this very difficult issue, which many Muslims think about, the question of the static and the dynamic, of the principle and its application to the world in which we live. Of course, this brings me up to the question, if the Sharia is applicable to all situations, who can then carry out ijtihad? The famous term, which has been branded about by so-called Islamic reformers, most of whom are called deformers, since the 19th century. Everybody wants to do ijtihad. Everybody says, oh, the gate of ijtihad was closed, it should open. First of all, in Shiism, of course, ijtihad was never closed, the gate of ijtihad. All of these things that we read in these books is not true of 12 Imam Shiism. And in Sunnism, the gate was never closed. The people who had the qualifications to carry out ijtihad didn't appear on the scene. This is one thing, and so many scholars write about. They should read the classical Sunni texts. What are the conditions that a person who is to be a mujtahid must have? The conditions were so stringent that after the 5th Islamic century, no one appeared like Imam Shafi'i to fulfill all of those conditions. There's nothing written in Sunni law that you cannot have another school of law or mujtahids. It's the question of who will fulfill the conditions. In Shiite law, you cannot not have ijtihad in every generation. Every generation must have those who can practice ijtihad. Now, the term ijtihad has been branded about, as I said, a great deal since the time of Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Muhammad Abdo, these people. Muhammad Iqbal, when you read him, every other word that he uses is ijtihad. Recently, someone wrote an article comparing yours truly with Muhammad Iqbal, a very famous Russian philosopher and Urdu scholar, who said the one big difference is that Iqbal uses the term ijtihad all the time and I don't use it at all. I have used it from time to time, but I don't use it on purpose because it has been really reduced to triviality practically, to the extent that anyone who goes and studies, let's say with Montgomery Watts and get his doctorate on early Islamic history at the University of Edinburgh, thinks now he can do ijtihad, he can carry out ijtihad. First of all, the moral qualifications. Where are the moral qualifications? Where are the real intellectual qualifications of really knowing the Quran and Hadith and all the earlier commentaries and studies by the great jurists over the ages? Where are they? I think once you get people who are at the level of ijtihad, ijtihad will be carried out. You don't have to talk about it. It needs a first-rate mind. Otherwise, anyone can get up in the morning and say, I'm carrying out ijtihad. And you end up with this disorder that we see in so much contemporary Islamic thought, in which a lot of people are saying a lot of things which 20 years later nobody even pays attention to. They are expressing, in the name of ijtihad, personal opinion. Ijtihad is not personal opinion. Ijtihad is a form of jihad. It comes from the same root. It is an exertion in the path of God on the basis of established principles to be able to take another step. And ijtihad is not limited to jurisprudence. It's not limited to the Sharia. You can carry out ijtihad in medicine, in physics, in philosophy, in kalam, in all different fields of endeavor. But to do that, you have to be a master. It's true in the field of physics today. Just let me give this example. A lot of people get their PhDs in physics, even from Berkeley or MIT, some good university. That doesn't mean every one of them can do ijtihad in physics. You have to be Werner Heisenberg or Einstein to do ijtihad. In that sense, that's how Islam understands ijtihad. That is somebody who's able to take the principles and teachings and findings of a science and take a new step. And this has been done in the field of physics only once or twice in the last few centuries. 4 or 5 times, I should not over-exaggerate. But all of these nice scientists we have around us, they're not performing ijtihad. They just work in the laboratories with the already given paradigms which they're applying to certain problems. To do ijtihad is precisely like the examples that I gave you. To, let's say, develop quantum mechanics, you have to be Niels Bohr, or bring up the theory of relativity. Now, we Muslims understand this in the field of physics, but when it comes to the question of Sharia, we're all practicing ijtihad all the time. Of course, that is the suicide of a religion. It must be fully understood who can practice ijtihad. It's very